she most likely has memories of her father being drunk and coming home and her trying to get him to bed. And so we get this nonsensical connection here. And it's clear at this point, or it should be becoming clearer, that she had some serious issues with her father. And this actually makes a lot of sense in that context. He was drunk and he just needed to go to bed. And that really set him off. So she goes into this lull where they get home and she tries to put the drunk older man to bed. And then she snaps back to reality here. And that really set him off. He tried to flip over the dining room table. He threw a chair at me so that we're back to the separation again. And he kept screaming at me until he stopped. And then he apologized. Then he said it would never happen again. He said he was really sorry. All right. We have an indicator of issues with her father here. Not just issues with her father, but violence from Doug that starts here and goes all the way through here. You'll find out later that he testifies in court in a hearing that he did these things. So we do know definitively that this stuff is true. He did do this stuff. Then he said, that's the negative statement, that it would never. So we have would and never put together. It would never. Anytime somebody says would never, 100% lie. Never is not 100% lie. But when you add would never, that would never happen, it's 100% lie. Never is just a really problematic statement. So you always have to analyze the heck out of it to see if it is justified in that situation. He said he was really sorry. So when somebody else says they're sorry, she can't help herself but to forgive them. And it's another indicator of her being an empath, overly empathetic. And the fact that she mentions it means that it stands out to her. It was important information to her, which is unfortunate, but it's reality. So he promised her it would never happen again. We have said, and never, which means obviously it's going to happen again. Ashley, did it happen again? Yes. I should just read one sentence ahead. Explain what happened. We had gone to church one Sunday, so she's back to this feeling of closeness. If you're like me, then at this point you're thinking, for God's sakes, girl, get the fuck out of there. Like, what are you doing? You keep going back. A normal person here is going to assume that she knows that she is in a terrible situation here with a psycho and she's got to go. She has to get out. She's already gotten all these text messages. She's already had violent encounters with him and she's still using the word we. Like, that means there is something wrong with her, but it's not probably what most people were thinking. She has a battered woman syndrome and I don't really know anything about that. So I can't speak intelligently on it, but I know that as long as the person keeps showing a certain type of affection and keeps saying those certain words, it doesn't matter how badly they behave after that, as long as they go back to that way of acting before. Anyway, so we have a lot of color in here. So let's look at this statement. We had gone to church. So you know that she feels close to him again on one Sunday. Now, church is an interesting thing. If you're talking about church or going to a movie or things like that, you're going to see the word after church, after the movie. These are indicators of glossing over time, but it's not time that's relevant to an incident. But very specifically, church, movies, the big game. Whether you go to a football game, you go to a soccer game, whether you watch it on TV, if you're watching a sporting event, you get this same rule here, which is that you will see the word after church, after the game, after the movie. They're just glossing over the content of the movie because they assume that you know what it's like to watch a movie, and everybody does. And so she says, after the service, that's the only reason I highlighted this here, was just to tell you about it. Then she says, that's actually a sensitive statement. We want to mark that. After everyone was leaving. So we get another after, and then we get leaving. But this is all explained because it's church. So people leave after church. That's what you're supposed to do. It's kind of like being late. Like, everyone has to leave. When the bar closes, everyone has to leave. It means you're under an obligation to go. It's not by your own choice. So these are all explained. I just wanted to explain these so that more videos in the future, when you see that, you know a little bit more about how to use those. Everyone was leaving. We talked. So talked is the friendly way of saying this. And we still have closeness here, to the pastor. I highlighted the because she doesn't say our pastor and she doesn't say my pastor. So this is a non-possessive pronoun, which tells me right here, subconsciously, she doesn't have any tie to the pastor. She doesn't think of the pastor as my pastor, which if somebody said my pastor, that means that they like them. If someone says the pastor, it means he could have been an AI bot for all she cared. And she doesn't say our pastor, which means that they either hadn't gone to church together before, or there was no sort of lasting relationship with this church or this pastor. So non-possessive pronouns, important. In like the lobby area in front, and at one point, Doug stormed off. Okay, so at one point, that is actually missing time here. So we get the explanation immediately after the missing time. So it's not problematic. You see that there's missing time, and all we know is that he stormed off. So there was an incident. We know that because Doug stormed off. We also know that because she said at one point. Now, we don't know what the incident was. Then by the time I caught up with him, that was in the parking lot, and he started cussing at me, calling me names. Okay, so again, we have started, and then we have violence from Doug. He started cussing at me, calling me names, and when we got back to the truck, he accused me of having a thing for the pastor. There's no physical violence here. We means that she still feels close to him even when he's cussing at her. And then he accused me of having a thing for the pastor. Again, she says the pastor. Now, he's controlling, obsessive, jealous. I mean, he's accusing her of having a thing for the pastor. She uses the word the, which means she gives absolutely zero indication here that she feels anything for the pastor at all. And there's no indicators of deception here. This is all exactly how a truthful person is going to talk. So we have indicator of violence. We have no indicators of deception. Again, he started calling me names. When we got back to the truck, he accused me of having a thing for the pastor. And he said I was a slut and a whore. And he screamed at me all the way home. All right. There's no indicators of deception here. He screamed at me. This is active voice. This is past tense. There's the correct pronouns. She separated them, which means she doesn't feel close to him in this moment. But the we is an indicator. And I'll tell you up front here, she uses we to mean that they're still married. She will use we all the time when they're married. That means that she still sees him as her husband. And then in the middle of a violent act, she will separate that we, but only very briefly, only while the violence is happening. So immediately after it's over and he starts being nice to her again, the we comes right back, which it's not an indicator of deception. It's an indicator of her mental state, which is that she keeps going back to him and she still has that attachment, which is, it's head shaking. I don't know how to describe it. Ashley, was he aggressive and threatening like in that other instance? She said, it started happening more and more with me, with our animals. He would hurt our pets. Would here indicates that she is aware that he was only hurting the pets as a punishment for her, as an example to her of what could happen to her. So she says he would hurt our pets. That would means it's conditional. So she's using would in the correct way here. And the next line, it says, on approximately how many occasions was he cruel to your pets? And she says a handful of times. So he wasn't cutting open the pets for fun. He was abusing the pets in front of her when he was mad at her. So that's what I meant by conditional. It was conditional. He did that as a threat to her. When he felt that she misbehaved, he was going to abuse the animals instead of abusing her to get out his violent tendencies, but also because she was so emotionally invested in the animals that it probably had more of an effect on her to abuse the animals than it would to abuse her directly. Because you've seen from the reoccurring we that she's always going to go back to him. He can abuse the hell out of her and she's going to go back to him. So it doesn't get the reaction that he wants, where when he abuses animals, it breaks her, which is what he wants to see. Okay, how would Doug react following a dark episode? If you're following me up to this point and you're still watching, you're probably glued to the screen at this point because this story gets intense and the questioning is very direct. Like it doesn't relent. If you haven't seen her testimony, this is a good spot for me to interject this. I am also very empathetic. And so when I see somebody crying on the stand, I have I use the word visceral a lot because it's it comes right from inside me, where I really hate seeing that because either the person is under extreme emotional distress, which causes me emotional distress, or they're faking it. And to fake emotional distress causes me extreme anger. And so I really don't like to see people crying on the stand. I want just a black and white statement that I can analyze. And so when I see her melting down on the stand, it's not something I want to see, especially in the beginning. It's distracting for me. And so it's very helpful when I can just make the transcript and go back and look at the verbiage. It's not that the emotion is problematic for me. It's that I need to understand what's driving the emotion before I watch the emotion play out. So back to the statement. Well, he was either really up or really down. And after, he would be very sweet. So after, again, how she uses after, about 4 days after we met, that he told me he loved me. So she uses the word started to indicate violence. Then she uses the word after to indicate affection. Really up or really down. And after, he would be very sweet. She doesn't want the abuse. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm saying. But she really looks forward to when he's sweet, right? That's the part that she looks forward to. And apologetic, and he'd be kind, and things would be good. And it was kind of like a flip of the switch, and something would set him off again. The would here is she's talking hypothetically, sort of generically, which is an appropriate use of the word would. So things would be good, and then something would happen and things would be bad. She's not pulling that from a direct memory. She's pulling that from accumulation of all her memories, which is normal. Did you find anything one day, Ashley, that gave you insight into Doug's marriage to his previous wife, Renee? Yes, sir. She doesn't over-explain. She knows the next question is coming, but she doesn't feel obligated to give the full answer up front. She's comfortable saying yes and then allowing that next question to come. That tells me that she's not trying to push her story out there. She is simply there to answer questions. This is a indicator of truthfulness. In a statement before that I was analyzing on Brian Higgins, you see him interject a bunch of information that hasn't been asked for yet. You know, I mean, an average person knows that that question is coming next. But when somebody feels that obligation to give you too much information up front, that is oftentimes a signal of deception. And so when you see somebody who is comfortable answering the questions and answering them directly and truthfully, that is just another indicator of truthfulness on top of the other indicators of truthfulness. So tell us what that was. I had been going through and kind of cleaning and organizing, and I was going through a bunch of old devices like phones and iPads, and I found a text conversation between Doug and Renee, his previous wife. All right, so I bolded this because originally she says, I had been going through, which is passive voice. She says I, and it is technically past tense. I had been going through, but it's passive voice, which means she's withholding some information here. And then she says, and kind of cleaning and organizing. So she's setting up, like, my question is, okay, was she going through his stuff? Which at this point, if I were her, I would be going through stuff. The guy's a psycho. So she should be. She should have left already, but no. So she's cleaning and organizing, and I was going through a bunch of old devices like phones and iPads. So then she just sort of turns around and tells you what it seems like she was covering up. But then she just tells you, I was going through a bunch of old devices like phones and iPads, and I found a texting conversation between Doug and Renee, his previous wife. So she has no issue with his previous wife either. Now, she died, but that doesn't necessarily mean, just because a previous wife passed away, it doesn't mean that she's going to be okay with the position that that previous wife filled. Because when someone gets remarried after their first spouse dies, it's almost like that person becomes immortal. And if they had a good relationship and that person dies, then it could feel like to the person coming in that there are shoes that that person can never fill. And so you would see hostility in the language at that point, but you don't see that. You have a good social introduction. She says a text conversation between Doug and Renee, his previous wife. That's very honest and direct. And that is the socially appropriate way to introduce her, which means I'm not seeing any sort of initial hostility towards loved ones in Doug's life that you would see from somebody who's obsessive and jealous. At this point, I have zero, we are 4 pages into this, and we have 0 indicators of deception that leads towards that type of personality. The only deception we have is when she tries to tell you that she is okay with his behavior, and she ends up lying about that. Let's keep going. Can you identify that, Ashley? I'm going to read this to you. So there was an objection, and the information is not allowed to come from Ashley. So the judge says it's okay for the lawyer to read it, the text messages, but Ashley can't read it. So this is just the lawyer at this point asking a question in the form of a narrative just to give the jury information. So it's important. So we'll read it. It's as if it's coming from her, really. I'm going to read this to you. Let me know if it's accurate. She says, okay.
I was deeply disappointed that you distorted the truth about who you really were when I married you. I loved you, though finding out you weren't really what you pretended to be. You kicking me so hard on New Year's Eve on our honeymoon because you were having trouble functioning in certain areas. You holding a gun to your head twice in my home that I opened to you with my children that still love you. Having to sell everything down to my wedding ring. Finding out you were on Viagra, which all of you had to do was tell me, you know I wouldn't care. Trying to film us making love on our honeymoon. Finding out that you wore eye pencil on and on. I loved you so much I didn't care. That's why I was shocked to think you would take pictures of me without asking. Is that accurate?
Yes.
So forensically, this was verified. It did come from Renee. And this is legit. Renee wrote this before she died. What this tells you is that Doug hasn't changed. What Ashley was telling the jury has all been reaffirmed by Doug's ex-wife who passed away. Ex-wife's probably not the right term. By Renee. From beyond the grave, she's telling you Doug is exactly what Ashley is telling you that he is. She had to sell everything down to her wedding ring. She doesn't say why, but he tried to video her without her knowing. I mean, all of this behavior has now been reaffirmed with another person. At this point, makes me want to go back and look at how she died. She died suddenly 8 or 9 months ago. I'm kind of interested to see how she died. We don't get to hear that in here, but one of the things that the media blew up was that Ashley, you'll see in the cross-examination that Ashley receives a package. And she says when she opened it, there was this overwhelming chemical smell. And so she took it to the police department. And everybody who sees that rolls their eyes. They're like, oh my God, Ashley's this type. He tries to send her a birthday present. She runs to the police department. He sent me this. I can smell chemicals. And the prosecutor keeps cutting her off when she tries to tell you that Hazmat had to respond when she took that to the police department. My next statement that I analyze after Ashley here is going to be anything that I can find on Renee's death here, because he seems to like this poison methodology that he tried to do later on Ashley here. All right. Tell us, Ashley, how Doug would act when he would go off. He, we have the repeating pronoun here, which is a sign of sensitivity for her. It's a sign of emotional sensitivity. He would call it a fit of rage. Sometimes it was as simple as him just yelling and screaming at me or cussing at me, calling me names. Other times he would throw things or break things or smash things. He would come at me like he was going to hit me. And he told me I was lucky that he punched walls instead of me. This is just a very direct statement. It's also something that he testified to. This is her baseline, and this is all truthful. Are there any incidences in particular, Ashley, that stand out to you? Yes. Tell us, please. Again, she's not jumping to tell you anything. She's just simply answering the questions that she's asked, and that is a strong indicator of honesty. We were having an argument. We have we here, and he came at me like he was going to hit me. Even as she's telling you they were having an argument, until she starts to relive it, she says we. And then she goes into this split of he was going to hit me. And our dog, Sully, so our is another version of we, she still sees them as married. She has not separated from him in her mind. Dog Sully jumped in between us and he punched him in the face so hard he knocked him out. I just remember screaming. I thought he had killed him. This is all direct. He punched him in the face. It's in the right tense. It's active voice. This is a very straightforward and just very honest statement. Were there other times that Doug hurt animals? I cut off part of this. There was a why question in here. Because he had hit, kicked, punched Sully. He threw our cat multiple times. One time he threw Snuffy, either Snuffy or Fluffy. Couldn't hear very well, down the stairs. So we're getting a very clear picture of Doug at this point. And we also have a very clear picture developing of Ashley herself. We don't have any indicators of deception yet. Everything she said is very straightforward. What kind of impact did this behavior have on you? She says, I was always walking on eggshells, trying to do the right things because I said the wrong thing, he would get mad at me. And so I always tried to do it right. If I had wore the wrong thing, he would call me a whore or a slut. I felt like I couldn't do anything right. Again, this is direct, active voice. It's the correct tense. And she feels the necessity to explain herself here, which I'm expecting that from her. She has shown that in her baseline, that she feels a necessity to explain herself. And that's most likely because of the way that she's had to explain herself for everything that she's had to do in her life. I'm guessing that probably goes back to her father, but that's just a guess at this point. It's definitive when we're talking about Doug, but my guess is that it probably stems back to before Doug. Was there an incident, Ashley, in June of 2017 that you vividly recall? She says, yes. He says, please explain. We were having an argument and it started, all right, we have started, so this is going to get bad. It started getting really out of hand. He pulled a gun out. Then he was like waving it around and he threw it at me and hit the wall behind me. It punched a hole in the wall. So I went to run to try to leave. So she's explaining and she says leave, which is an indicator of conflict. I would expect to see leave here. He pulled the gun out and held it to his head. He said that he was going to blow his fucking brains out. I was going to watch him and he pulled the trigger and he shot a hole in the ceiling in the kitchen. This is a very direct statement. Again, there's no indicators of deception. We get an indicator of actual violence here. He also testified to this. So we know that he actually did this and that there's no indicators of deception when she tells us about this. Ashley, at this point, what were you thinking about your marriage? That's a good question. I've been thinking that for quite a while. He wasn't anything like I thought he was. I felt like I had made a really big mistake marrying him. So that's pretty direct. And it shows that she's not as, let's say, out of touch with reality as one might think. Seems like I was living in a nightmare because I never knew what I was going to get. Kind of just go with the flow. I didn't want to rock the boat ever. So I never knew what I was going to get. Never is often an indicator of deception. And what this is telling you is I never knew what I was going to get is a way of saying that I knew exactly what I was going to get. It is deception. It is deceptive. And I hesitate to say she's lying because it's phrased in a way that it's meant to be understood as being deceptive. I never knew what I was going to get means that she knew that she was going to get his dark side, let's call it. Other than that, everything here is very direct. There's negative statements in here, but they're not connected to the explanatory statement. We know why she gives explanatory statements, and everything in here is contracted. So he wasn't anything like I thought he was. That's correct tense, correct pronouns. It is contracted. It's direct. It's painting a really, really bad picture though. Did you have a difficult pregnancy? Yes, I was really sick. Did you go home from South Carolina to stay with your mom in Bradenton at the end of August? Yes, sir. Did there come a time when you returned to South Carolina? Yes. Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Ashley, why you returned to South Carolina? I had decided that I was going to leave him. That makes sense. I don't know. We need to explain this anymore. Whenever she says leave it, there's always conflict. I was going to leave him. In fact, if she ever doesn't say leave, that would be the indicator here. This entire marriage is just one long conflict. So I went back to get my things. When he brought me down, I didn't even have like a suitcase or anything. This is not actually a repeated word here because she says he didn't, and then she says I didn't. So either in her mind, she didn't pack and she initially started to blame him, or he didn't let her take her stuff and she started by telling the truth, and then she wanted to diffuse that by putting the blame on herself, which based on her personality, my guess is that because she's always direct and honest, she probably started by telling the truth, which is that he wasn't, when he took her down there, he probably didn't give her time to pack. And then she switched that so that she put the blame on herself. I didn't even have like a suitcase or anything. So I went back to get my stuff and so now we have some sensitivity here. I would expect something sensitive after this. And she says, wrote him a note and left him a letter saying why I was leaving. Okay. She says she left him a note, a letter. Actually, when she started writing it, it started out as a note and then it turned into a letter. So there's a change of language there, which tells us that she was going to leave him a note. And then as she started writing, it became a formal letter to her. And she decided that was it. This is going to be the formal acknowledgement. This tells us a couple of things here. Number one, she is very adverse to conflict. So some people call this passive aggressive, but in this situation where if you were to tell him that you're leaving him, he's probably going to threaten to kill you. The last time before this, he pulled out a gun, threw it at her, and then pointed it at his head and then moved it slightly and pulled the trigger. So at this point, leaving a note probably seems like a good idea, but we can see that she's adverse to conflict here, which that goes right in line with everything that we've seen about her so far. How did you feel about your personal safety when you left Doug? She says, I was scared. Okay, inserting emotion into a statement is a strong indicator of deception. Ashley doesn't do that, which is a strong indicator of truthfulness. She never inserts emotion into her statements. She answers the questions directly and doesn't try and say, oh, and I felt this way and I felt that way. Because her defense attorney wants that emotion to come across to the jury, he has to actually end up asking her direct questions about how she felt. So you'll see this a couple of times. She never inserts her own emotion, which is a sign of truthfulness. And so you're going to get him asking that question. So she has to just tell you that. It almost sounds odd for her to just give an answer that is just an emotion. But for this, it's important to look at the question. How did you feel about your personal safety when you left Doug? And she says, I was scared. That is a direct and honest answer. And the fact that she's including emotion in here is because that's what the question was asking her. So what was it that made you uncomfortable? She said, we've already covered this, but she says it was a lot of things, the things that he had done, like punching our dog and shooting the gun, and certain things he would say and do. Again, it's already been covered. And were you afraid for just you? And she says, I was pregnant at the time. I was scared for the baby. Again, you can't get any more honest than this. This is a short, direct answer that answers the question using I, past tense, and active voice. As a deception detection expert, you literally can't ask for a clearer answer than that. Were there instances, Ashley, where you felt that your own safety had been placed in danger as a result of conduct by him? Yes. Can you give us some examples? Again, she doesn't over-explain. She waits for the question. I guess one thing that comes to mind is sometimes he would drive really scary, yelling and screaming at me, like running up on curbs. One time he almost hit a tree. This is just question and answer. Like, there's nothing deceptive about any of these answers. Describe kind of things that would be done to intimidate you. He would get in my face. He'd yell at me. He'd come at me like he was going to hit me. What about breaking things? He would break things, smash things. He threw things at me. Again, she doesn't want to over-explain these things. She's just telling you what happened. And all of this stuff, if you're wondering, again, if she's like a psychopath and she's just throwing this stuff out there without emotion, Doug testified to this stuff. So none of this stuff is in question. How would you describe, if you were using adjectives, his behavior? So because she's so direct, the defense attorney is not getting the emotion or the storytelling that he wants for the jury. And so she says, possessive, controlling, manipulative, aggressive, scary, unpredictable. It's just a direct answer. Now, this doesn't tell us anything. We can't assess this for honesty because it has to be in the form of a complete sentence. We need an actual statement in order to assess it. But this is exactly what she was asked for. He says, using basically just adjectives, describe his behavior. Ashley, did you take any steps in addition to leaving this letter to protect yourself in South Carolina? Yes. What did you do? I filed a domestic violence injunction, a protective order. Did the court grant the injunction? Yes, sir. Was that order that the judge decreed violated? Yes. How? He sent me a package in the mail. What was the package represented to be? She says, a birthday gift, I believe. It was sent to her as a package around her birthday. She assumed that it was a birthday gift. And did you open it? Yes. What happened? Now, this statement, these are the type of statements that the media uses and blows this stuff up, and to create that automatic reaction from people who watch this story on social media or on the regular media. And it's that type of thing that's usually deceptive. And so when you hear this, you check that box like, oh my gosh, she's one of these. She says, well, when I opened it, there was an overwhelming smell, like a real strong chemical smell, and I got like an instant headache. So that seems like a deceptive, rehearsed answer only because as the listener, we've been programmed to hear things like that and automatically assume that it's deceptive. There's nothing deceptive about the way she says this. In fact, in cross-examination, the prosecutor tries to hit her on this, and she starts talking about something about how hazmat, when she took it to the police, they had to test it because of the overwhelming fumes. And then the prosecutor cuts her off and specifically doesn't let her say, she says hazmat, but then she literally talks over her because she doesn't want the jury to hear that this was actually true. She only wanted to make it look like she's crazy. The prosecutor was painting a picture and not allowing reality to be a part of that picture, which from my perspective was just really frustrating. Did you report that to the police? Yes. What did you do with the package after you opened it? I sealed it back up and I put it in the garage before I brought it to the sheriff's department. So she uses the word before, which that tells us that she put it in the garage and there's missing time there. So she doesn't say how quickly she brought it to the sheriff's office. She may have just written it off. The prosecutor made it sound like she blew this out of proportion and took it to the police to try and make up fake charges against Doug, when in reality, she did exactly the opposite. It was chemicals and she boxed it up and put it in her garage until she realized this needs to go to the police, which was probably at the advice of her lawyer. Now, you told us when you received the package, aside from the contents giving you a headache, that it was in violation of the South Carolina restraining order. Yes. Did you, when you contacted the police, request that they take some action? Yes. What was the result? She says, no charges. Ashley, when did you give birth to Emerson? She says, March 19th, 2018. Do you remember how long the South Carolina restraining order was to last? She says, I believe it was 6 months. Does there come a time when you're concerned about the South Carolina restraining order expiring? Yes. So at or about the time of that, what steps, if any, did you take to protect yourself? I filed for a domestic violence injunction here in Florida. And what was the result? It was denied. Was there any direct event with respect to Emerson? There was a time-sharing agreement set up. Shortly after that, or at about the same time, was there additional litigation that you filed? Yes. Do you recall what that was? Divorce and termination of parental rights. In the termination of parental rights petition, Ashley, did you advise the court in your petition about prior domestic acts of violence by Doug? Yes. Can you tell us today what you told the court? She says, I talked about him punching Sully and kicking him, throwing our cat Fluffy, about him trapping me, grabbing me, yanking me, shooting the gun in the house, punching holes in the walls, when he trapped me in the closet, smashing things like that. At this point, it's almost become routine for her. Again, it's all direct, correct tense, correct pronouns, and Doug testified to this. So what was the outcome? All right, as part of the domestic violence injunction that you filed here in Florida, that was before Judge Moreland, was a deposition taken of Doug? Yes. Does Doug admit to shooting the gun in the house? Yes. Does Doug admit to throwing the gun at you? Yes. Does he admit punching holes in the drywall in the house? Yes. Does he admit to punching the dog and rendering him unconscious? Yes. I want to ask you, Ashley, if I can, about other instances of abusive conduct. Was a tracker at any time placed on your car? Yes. Was it done with your permission? No. Ashley, did Doug admit to placing an illegal tracker on your vehicle? She says, yes, in a message to me. So she is not only truthful, but she's truthful and complete in her answers. She doesn't omit either. This is very specifically not something that Doug admitted to in court. This wasn't part of his testimony in court. And so she says, in a message to me. So she does have the evidence. She has the text message. Did you report that to the police? Yes. What was the result? No charges. Were there incidents, Ashley, where Doug would appear unexpectedly? Yes, a lot. And how would that come about? Can you give us an example? I'd be driving down the road and I'd see him in the rearview mirror, a couple cars behind me, or he'd be right behind me, or sometimes he would show up at places that I was, and I was just unexpected. I'd see him, or like in the parking lot. Now, this makes sense if he has a tracker on her car, that he would just be able to show up anywhere. Was this also during the time that the South Carolina injunction was in place? And she says both then and after as well. So we have a missing time, which we've seen before. Did you report those incidences to the police? Yes. What was the result? No charges. Was there an incident with the neighbor, Ashley? Yes. Where you were present? Yes. He was outside in the yard at night looking in the windows of my house. And was this reported to the police? Yes. Did they respond? Yes, they came out. What was the result? No charges. Was there an incident, Ashley, where you and your mother came home to find someone in the driveway of your home? Yes. Who was it? It was Doug. What did he do when he saw you? He was on foot in front of the house, and when he saw us, he took off running. Did you call the police? Yes, I had to call several times before they sent someone out. Did they take a report? They did, but by the time they finally got there, he was long gone. So the I shows her emotional involvement in this statement. And if he was on foot in front of their house and she called the police multiple times because they weren't responding, this is likely due to fear for her own safety. You're seeing a double I here, because if he's on foot, it means he didn't go very far. And the police, it took them so long that she called them multiple times. And by the time they finally came out, they couldn't find him. So again, no charges. Again, he's just stalking the house. So what was the result? No charges. Was there a time back around May 2020 where you wanted to learn about co-parenting with an abuser? She says, yes. Okay, did you take any steps, Ashley, to try to determine how to co-parent? Yes. All right, what was that? So keep in mind here that the police took her computer, forensically analyzed it. This is where the police do an investigation and they try to see, was she looking up, how many times do I have to shoot him in the chest to kill him? Things like that. That shows that the shooting was premeditated, but instead her search that they found. I did some Googling and reading to try to find helpful articles on what to do to make things good. And will you tell us what the subject you researched was? So she was looking up domestic co-parenting with an abuser. How do I co-parent with an abuser? Co-parenting versus parallel parenting with an abusive ex. The Good Men Project. 6 tips. And then the search result that came up was the Good Men Project. 6 tips to help you co-parent with an abusive ex. This is not something she was telling to anyone else. This is at night on her computer. She's searching this on her own, trying to figure out on her own. That tells you this is her reality. And the police found this forensically on her computer. So she was asked about this in court. And she says, yes, I was looking up, how do I try to live with an abuser? Did he turn out to be who you thought he was? No, not at all. I want to direct your attention, Ashley, now if I can, to September 27th, 2020. Okay. Specifically late in the afternoon, would you tell us why Doug was at your home? He came over to help load some of the larger items that my mom and I had kind of pre-staged in the garage into the U-Haul truck. So at this point, they had made plans. Actually, Doug had made these plans for her that they were going to move together to Maryland, I believe. According to the prosecutor, she made it sound like Ashley was misleading him, telling him that, yes, she wanted to go with him and stuff like that. But we can tell at this point, based on her personality, that she's afraid of confrontation. She's probably afraid of confrontation in general, but she is in a situation here with a psychopath who gets off on fear tactics, on abusing animals, on all this stuff that he's admitted to in court. And so for her to not want to tell him to his face that she's not going to go with him makes absolute sense. It also, when you think about the fact that she tried to press charges against him multiple times and nothing was ever done. This tells me, number one, I don't want to live in Florida.